It's currently the middle of October, and here in the United States, we're rapidly approaching another general election. Like every 4 years, this year's election features a presidential race, which is a big deal, particularly this year, which you may have noticed. Here in California, in addition to the presidential race, there are also a number of local and statewide elections and a number of propositions as well. Election season can be a very emotionally and psychologically fraught time, particularly this year, which you may have also noticed. That is why we from the Solidarity Network at San Jose State University felt it was important to talk about it. Joining us today is Craig Alimo.
So I'm Craig, he, him, his, and due to the pronouns I use, and my role in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is, I have a strange title, it is Diversity and Inclusion Trainer/Educator.
We will be discussing tools that will hopefully equip you and prepare you in case you find yourself confronted with a difficult dialogue soon. So, to get started, I think it might be kind of cool to hear from you about, what is dialogue? What does it mean to be engaged in dialogue, and how does that differ from other forms of conversation, like debates, for instance?
Yeah. When we think about dialogue, I think what maybe a good place to start is to think about what it isn't. And particularly since that this conversation is really grounded in how we are thinking about how we engage with people in conversations that might have different perspectives than we do, maybe political perspectives, maybe even identity-based perspectives. Certainly double whammy or triple whammy with the pandemic and the way in which our country is remembered the impacts of structural racism from the summer with the vigilante killings of Ahmaud Arbery or the police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many others, right? So we're in the middle of that context, and I think that, thinking about dialogue is, I think, a great place for us to start. That first presidential debate between the two candidates, I think is a great example of what dialogue isn't.
Vote now. Make sure you, in fact, let people know you're a senator. I'm not going to answer the question because the question is radical left. Will you shut up, man? Listen, who are the people who testified under oath? So let me ask you this.
No, go ahead, mister. I'm listening to you.
Because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. This is a left-wing problem.
If you think about what some of the goals are around debates, maybe you got some highlights of that 2 weeks ago about, like, pushing your own perspective, trying to, well, and in the case of that particular debate, drowning out your opponent, defending your own position, defeating somebody else's, trying to convince people of something that is right over wrong. I also don't want to depict all debate as bad, right? I think we get in this binary really easily to say, well, what happened 2 weeks ago was crap. And right, there's plenty of debates, and it's, there are plenty of debates that are good. There are plenty of debates that happen where the participants who are in the debate, like, follow the rules of the debate, right? So, for example.
To me, debate is it's like any other competitive sport, right? The whole goal is to do better than the other person. So, like football, every yard I get is a yard you lose. So whether it's bolstering my point or shooting down your point, that's another yard in my favor, right?
I would say that I have a preference towards dialogue, and I think that when we think about dialogue, there's a lot of things that are going on for dialogue that debate doesn't have. I think another thing that's different about dialogue than debate is about our use of emotions, and I think that emotions are probably a lot more. I think there's a fuller range of emotions that are available to us in dialogue that are not available in debate. Right? So in debate, I think that we are comfortable with, like maybe even anger or frustration. We can still have those in dialogue, right? But we might have a whole other range. I mean, like, what would it mean if one of our presidential candidates cried on the stage? What would be what would be the headlines the next day? Totally
Right.
not. Like that person would probably get there would probably be lots of negative press about that candidate if they were to say be vulnerable and cry on stage. You know what I mean? Like I think that, not to say that, you know, a good dialogue means everybody cries. That's not what I mean. But what I do mean is that I think that we have a maybe as we voice what's important to us, as we want to make sure that what we get across is heard, we can do that with a variety of emotions. And I think that the vulnerability that we might be able to share with the people in which we are engaged in dialogue with, I think, is something that only engenders more trust, right?
So, I mean, what would you say would be the goal to dialogue?
So maybe one quality of dialogues are maybe seeking understanding, right? So I might want to try to really get to know somebody else's perspective. We might not be bound to time, right? We might listen more than we talk. We might. So what are some of the goals of dialogue you're saying? Maybe it's more relationship building than it necessarily is to, you know, defeat. I like the analogy you use, Chris, around, you know, a football game. Every yard I gain is a yard you lose. So there might not be a sense of competition per se in dialogue. Having the courage to be able to stay in a conversation too, even when it is maybe difficult, or when trying to figure out others' perspectives, or hearing others' types of maybe there's more testimony, I would say, maybe in dialogue than there would be necessarily in debate. Although we get snippets of testimony in debate. You know, let me talk about, you know, Craig Alimo from the Midwest who doesn't have health care. You know, something like that, right? That's sort of like a third person, I suppose, type of testimony. But I feel like, you know, when people are in dialogue, they talk about their own experiences. They talk about how perspectives might impact them, or how systems might impact them, particularly as we're talking about, if we're talking about, or if we're dialoguing about social inequality, for example. I mean, what's a question we oftentimes, I mean, I'm using the presidential debate just because it's so recent. But like, one of the first things you hear about people talking about after debate is like, who won?
Right.
You know, we might not ask that question on the other end of a dialogue. In fact, we might even run out of time to finish our conversation, or the dialogue that we're having. We might not come to any conclusions.
So let's talk a little bit about how to build a dialogue then. What would you say to folks? Okay, so somebody says, okay, I want to have a dialogue, not a debate, because it's important for me to, you know, preserve the relationship with this person. It's important for me to not think of it as a competition, whatever it is that gets them to that point. And then now it's like, okay, what are the elements of a dialogue? How do I build a dialogue?
There might need to be like maybe some element of trust.
Right. Okay.
With the person that you might be dialoguing with, right? There might be some common things like, you know, I want to understand more, or there might be some unspoken sort of commonalities. I'm not saying like, I'm not trying to be kumbaya about this, you know, because I feel like when we talk about dialogue, we can get kumbaya pretty quick. And what I mean by that is like, you know, over the top, like, can't we all get along sort of stuff. And I don't think that is necessarily an outcome of dialogue either.
Right.
Although it can be. But, you know, I think that there's a number of things that one probably needs to do in order to be successful in a dialogue. And that might be about like, maybe listening more than talking might be one sort of at least behavioral thing that we can do when we're in dialogue, right? We might also, and this might not be satisfying. I feel like I want to say this too about dialogue, and that is particularly in the way in which that we these days engage, particularly in forums like social media. I mean, you've heard the phrase about like, you know, being in an echo chamber where like I'm sharing my views and outrage about a particular candidate or a particular candidate's record over time that enrages me, and I'm sharing that with my own friends, and we talk back and forth, right? So so while that might be dialogistic, I'm not sure we're what are we learning? You know what I mean? So we might need to be prepared to suspend judgment, right? When we're in dialogue. I might need to I think it's impossible not to be judgmental or not to be biased about a particular topic or issue but I think there are times in which we might want to hold those ideas maybe just a little bit smaller so that we can create some space for us to be able to hear, to be able to take in the context, the meaning, the history of what somebody else might be sharing about their own perspective that might be different than our own. And I think that's hard. I think that's really hard to do in dialogue, is to suspend judgment, right? So as much as, and I'll be honest, what might be a good example of this about suspending judgment? I have several people in my family who have a different political perspective than I do. And I'll be honest, I'm probably not that good at suspending judgment all the time, like with my racist Uncle Bill. But when he sends out these emails to the rest of the family, I'm debating with him. I'm really not dialoguing with him. But to my point, if I were sitting in the same room with my Uncle Bill, I might want to, yell at him about how the perspective that he is offering is racist or less specifically oppressive to a group of people. I think that would take a lot for me to sit in there and talk with my Uncle Bill about this, racism in the United States, right? To be able to suspend judgment is really hard to do. As we might really want, because we might want to, even let's say I'm listening to my Uncle Bill say racist stuff, and I might be thinking of a response right away about well, that's racist because X, Y, Z, PDQ, and he's still talking. Well, I might still think it's racist at the end of the day. I wonder if it would help for me to hear more about what has informed his perspective. One tool that I'm trying to use a lot more frequently, and I'm not very good at it, because I get sometimes, if I hear stuff that I have emotional response to, I get triggered, or I'm distracted. I'm oh my gosh, I can't believe somebody said that. But I'm trying to use this technique of repeating what somebody said, right? So if somebody says something that's that I immediately might perceive as microaggressive or macroaggressive. I might say something I'm not sure I heard that correctly. Could you repeat that? When I have my wits about me, I'm able to do something like that, right? And that's a way to let me make sure, let me give this person the benefit of the doubt to make sure I heard that correctly. And if they repeat the same thing and say, well, what is, this is what I heard and this is how it impacts me, or this is, I'm wondering how you learned about that.
Right.
Tell me what the value is behind that. I mean, I'm getting into, that piece around inquiry and reflection.
Right. Well, and that's a second piece, right? So the first piece you mentioned was repeating, right? Let me just give myself a pause, as well as give you an opportunity to maybe something didn't come across right, whatever. Can you just repeat what you said? Right. It gives me a pause. It gives you a chance to say it again. So that's one piece. And then the other piece you mentioned just now is asking where it comes from, right? And then saying, to the other person, well, what did you mean by that? Where does that come from?
Where did you learn that? What's the source?
Right. Where did you learn it? What's the source? Because it allows for somebody to kind of explain a little bit, and it might still be exactly what you assume it to be, but it gives them the opportunity to say what it is, rather than having you make a few assumptions along the way. And I also think getting that perspective allows us an ability to be able to walk somebody towards common ground, right?
Yeah.
I think you know, when I think about my own racist family members, just telling them to their face that what they said is wrong and racist isn't necessarily productive, because it doesn't honor whatever experiences they've gone through to get to that point. Being able to hear their perspective and then being able to address specifically what they went through and being able to say, you know, I appreciate that you went through that, but, you know, have you thought about, you know, PDQ or whatever,
Right.
allows us to kind of walk somebody forward in a more productive way. It doesn't necessarily shut down that dialogue.
Riffing on what you just shared, Chris, like if I were to start my conversation with my Uncle Bill and say, that's racist. I mean, that's a conversation start. Stopper, right? That's not a starter. Or even like, do you think Donald Trump is racist? That's also a conversation starter. It's a yes or no. You know,
Right.
It's a yes/no question. It's a binary question. You know what I mean? And that is another technique that I would say is probably more common with debate, to rhetorically yes/no somebody into a corner. You know, there are other things I think about that are a part of dialogue, sort of like behavioral things, like about asking questions, asking open-ended questions, and thinking about that, or thinking about those perspectives, or maybe working some of those perspectives through by maybe even asking more questions. I mean, not in a way that's like, well, tell me what you think about this, and tell me what you think about this, and tell me what you think, you know, like that's just being cross-examined at a courtroom situation.
Right.
But like, you know, let people, you know, and using maybe listening twice as more frequently as you're speaking, right? I mean, our viewers have or listeners have no context for this, but just to say it for a second, like I shared in the beginning of our conversation that like we talked for like almost 40 minutes before we started this video, right? So in that conversation, I think that both of us, we were talking about like labor unions and things like that. In the context, we were bringing up, let me, you know, this idea of identifying what assumptions I have as I'm coming into this conversation. Like, you know, I'm assuming that, whether it be the context of our conversation about labor on campus or honoring labor, things like that was an assumption of mine. Like, I think labor is a good thing. You know, I know you do too. But that was maybe an underlying assumption that we had going into the conversation. Like, maybe if I'm going into a conversation with somebody about a policy, it might be good to identify what my assumptions are or what your assumptions are going into the conversation as well, or in the context of asking questions and reflecting on those questions. I think it's always good to have an informed dialogue too. I think if everything I've learned about a particular issue I pulled off of my my Instagram wall or my Facebook wall, or you know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure I'm informed about that issue very well. You know? Like, because if I'm getting that information from friends of mine who might share a perspective of mine, sure, it's going to give us some information or some nuggets of what is accurate about a particular position, right? Some facts, you know. But like, you know, to be informed, I think is important.
Let's build a toolbox for our students, right? So in our toolbox so far, what we have talked about is trying your best to reduce the amount of space judgment takes up, right? Asking questions, building perspective, and then also underlying assumptions, right? That's something that you just talked about. What else can we put in this toolbox?
I'm thinking about two more. I'm thinking one is about respect. And what I mean by respect in this context, again, maybe to talk about its opposite, you know, how might, you know, maybe going back to my racist Uncle Bill, I don't have a lot of respect for Uncle Bill right now. You know, what would it mean for me to be respectful of Uncle Bill, who he is, his history, where he's come from? Would that help shift the dynamic? You know what I mean? Like, how can I enter into a dialogue respecting, you know, really wanting to respect somebody's perspective, some of their positions, some of their experiences in life, or all of their experiences in life, for that matter, not just some of them, to really be able to honor not just that other person or those other people that I'm talking with, but that space that we're in too, right? That for that moment in time, if I am, doing some of these other things we've talked about already, like I'm suspending my judgment, I'm listening more, all of that's going to add to a place that is a container, a space, a third space that you and the other people or person share, and being respectful of that. So, which might look very different than maybe the way we might engage in, like, say, social media about different positions. Sound like having the courage to speak your truth, having the courage to voice what it is that that informs your positions, and not to apologize for them too, right? So, like, if I'm having a conversation about somebody about Prop 25 and bail, I want to voice my perspective. I want to voice my opinion. I want to voice something that I think is important, even if it's a little bit risky. We could talk about maybe some of the limits of dialogue. So, like, I think what's really hard about dialogue too is, like, well, what do we agree that are things that what are the things that we can agree on, as a baseline to our conversation? I think that in some ways facts matter, but that might be one particular limit of dialogue, right? It's like, if we can't have a space, if we can't have a third space for the two of us to enter, that might make it pretty hard,
right? But what would you say for somebody who says, you know what, I don't think we have that common ground?
What if we were to roll out some stats? What if one were able to do some research and sort of put that stuff out? If the person says New York Times, oh, that's fake news. I don't know. I think that's a limit. There's got to be something, some common language. There's got to be something.
Right. So to me, if you hit that limit, right, that's probably a sign that you need to disengage and just say, you know what, I'm done. It's fine. I'm gonna go take care of myself.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna make sure that I have the emotional and psychological needs of my own met, and I'm not gonna worry about this person.
Folks from marginalized communities, right? People with marginalized identities, targeted identities by social inequality. It's a survival skill. Am I right? For some of us to be able to disengage from a conversation might be more safe. It might be psychologically or maybe even physically. Who knows? Depending on the context, right? I will say maybe another strategy might even be about, like, if we can't agree, tell me about how you learned about this value, where this doesn't matter. One of my mentors, this person, Patricia Gurin, would say something to the effect of, tell me what your definition of justice is. Like, maybe that's like going to roots, like, what is the root? What is this, your perspective, what is that based in? So maybe it's even digging a little bit further. If we're willing to, ask more questions, ask more, be able to reflect on that, maybe that's another strategy to get what's behind that or what's underneath that.
I do want to say, at the end of the day, you need to do what's safe and equitable for you, right? So,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, if you can't engage, don't feel like you had to, right?
Right on.
These are just tools that we're talking about for moments where you feel like, I do want to talk to racist Uncle Bill. Like, I want racist Uncle Bill to know that I think of things differently.
I think another limit we've talked about already is they're not as, I think the dialogues aren't necessarily, like, they don't always have a clear beginning, middle, or end. We might not be satisfied,
right,
with how it ends, we might not be satisfied with where we are in the middle. We may realize we need to dialogue more. Maybe we never get there. We don't have the time, or we don't have the space, and we don't have the commitment to be. So I think there are lots of ways that dialogue has its limits as well.
If you reach the end of your time or your energy and the dialogue doesn't have a satisfying end, which more often than not happens that way, it's okay to give yourself kudos for even engaging, right? And say, you know what, I took the time and effort to talk and try to listen. And, we may not have gotten very far, but that in of itself took courage and commitment.
And, maybe, just maybe, there's a seed planted. I know that's trite to even say that. Maybe I planted a seed. Maybe I have.
Thank you, Craig, for taking the time out of your day and your busy schedule to do this recording.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chris, also to chat. As always, it's always good fun and a pleasure, and way cool. If you're really curious, if you, as a student, as you're thinking about this and you're maybe even experimenting, right, or dialoguing with other folks, if you're really interested in doing this some more, I would love to encourage you to check out our intergroup dialogue program. We're paused at the moment. We're looking to hopefully restart some stuff up in the spring of 2021. So if you want to look at this website right here, go ahead and click on that, or copy that into your favorite browser and check it out.